The transmission of traits from generation to generation affects your appearance, your behavior, and your health. Understanding how these traits are inherited is important in understanding traits you may pass on to a future generation. Hi, and welcome back. In today's biology segment, I will talk about Mendelian inheritance of human traits.
Mendelian inheritance of human traits. Making a pedigree. At some point, you have probably seen a family tree, either for your family or someone else's. A family tree traces a family name and various family members through a successive generations. Through a family tree, you can identify the relationships among your cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and great-grandparents. Pedigrees illustrate inheritance. A pedigree is a graphic representation of genetic inheritance. It is a diagram made up of a set of symbols that identify males and females, individuals affected by the trait being studied, and family relationships. At a glance, it looks very similar to any family tree. Some commonly used pedigree symbols are shown in the illustration. In a pedigree, a circle represents a female. A square represents a male. Shaded circles and squares represent individuals showing the trait being studied. Unshaded circles and squares designate individuals that do not show the trait. A half-shaded circle or square represents a carrier, a heterozygous individual. A horizontal line connecting a circle and a square indicates that the individuals are parents, and a vertical line connects parents with their offspring. Each horizontal row of circles and squares in a pedigree designates a generation, with the most recent generation shown at the bottom. The generations are identified in sequence by Roman numerals, and each individual is given an Arabic number. Analyzing a pedigree. An example of a pedigree for a fictitious rare recessive disorder is shown in this photograph. This genetic disorder could be any of several recessive disorders, which shows up only in the affected person carries two recessive alleles for the trait. Suppose individual from the third generation individual 1 in the pedigree wants to know the likelihood of passing on this allele to her children. By studying the pedigree, the individual will be able to determine the likelihood that she carries the allele. Notice that information can also be gained about other members of the family by studying the pedigree. For example, you know that from generation 1, so here is the generation 1, individual 1 and 2 are both carriers of the recessive allele for the trait because they have produced from generation 2, individual 3 who has the recessive phenotype. That's why it's colored in kind of blue. If you drew upon a square for the mating of individuals from this generation 1 and 2, you will find, according to Mendelian segregation, that the ratio of homozygous dominant to heterozygous to homozygous recessive genotypes among their children would be 1, 2, and 1. Of those genotypes possible for the members of generation 2, only the homozygous recessive genotype will express the trait, which is the case for generation 2, individual 3. Because none of the children in generation 3 are affected, and because the recessive allele is rare in the general population, it is reasonably safe to assume that from generation 2, individual 1 is not a carrier. You know that from generation 2, individual 2 must be a carrier like her parents because she has passed on the recessive allele to subsequent generation fourth. Because generation 1 has one parent who is heterozygous and the other parent who is assumed to be homozygous normal, generation 3 individual 1 most likely has 1 in 2 chance of being a carrier. Simple recessive heredity. Most genetic disorders are caused by recessive alleles. Cystic fibrosis is a fairly common genetic disorder among white Americans. Approximately 1 in 28 white Americans carry the recessive alleles, and 1 in 2,500 children born to white Americans inherits that disorder. Due to a defective protein in the plasma membrane, cystic fibrosis results in the formation and accumulation of thick mucus in the lungs and digestive tract. Physical therapy, special diets, and new drugs have continued to raise the average life expectancy of people that have CF. Tay-Sachs disease is a recessive disorder of the central nervous system. In this disorder, a recessive allele results in the absence of an enzyme that normally breaks down a lipid produced and stored in tissues of the central nervous system. Because this lipid fails to break down properly, it accumulates in the cells. The allele for Tay-Sachs is especially common in the United States among Ashkenazic Jews whose ancestors came from Eastern Europe. Phenylketonuria, also called PKU, is a recessive disorder that results from the absence of an enzyme that converts one amino acid, phenylalanine, to a different amino acid, tyrosine. Because phenylalanine cannot be broken down, it and its byproducts accumulate in the body and result in severe damage to the central nervous system. The PKU allele is most common in the United States among people whose ancestors came from Norway, Sweden, or Ireland. Simple dominant heredity. Unlike the inheritance of recessive traits in which a recessive allele must be inherited from both parents for a person to show the recessive phenotype, many traits are inherited just as the rule of dominance predicts. Remember that in Mendelian inheritance, a single dominant allele inherited from one parent is all that is needed for a person to show the dominant trait. Simple dominant traits. A cleft chin is one example of a simple dominant trait. If you have a cleft chin, you've inherited the dominant allele from at least one of your parents. A widow's peak hairline and earlobe types are other dominant traits that are determined by simple Mendelian inheritance. There are many other human traits that are inherited by simple dominant inheritance. Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a lethal genetic disorder caused by a rare dominant allele. It results in a breakdown of certain areas of the brain. No effective treatment exists. Because the onset of Huntington's disease usually occurs between the age of 30 and 50, an individual may already have had children before knowing whether he or she is affected. A genetic test has been developed that detects the presence of this allele.